On the Apple TV show Ted Lasso, the main character Ted is playing darts against a man called Rupert. If you've seen the show, there's a point where it's assumed by a lot of people in the pub watching that he won't win. In fact, everyone in the pub is laughing at him. And Ted says to Rupert, "You know, Rupert, guys have underestimated me my entire life. And for years, I never understood why. I saw this quote by Walt Whitman and it said, 'Be curious, not judgmental.'" In this episode, Jodie...
Hi, my name's Jodie Thompson. I'm a paediatric nurse consultant currently working in the community. I used to be working at one of our tertiary children's hospitals in Sydney for about 26 years and now exclusively work for myself in the community.
And Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Lane Brown. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in the community with people with neurological disabilities. I previously also worked in the public health system in a similar role with Jodie.
And myself talk about how being curious to ask questions without judgment is the key element for children with a disability when entering primary school. This is a two-part series. We'll be following this with an upcoming episode about high schoolers and disability. Our primary audience is people who have sustained traumatic spinal cord injuries at an adult age, but today we're actually talking about children who have either sustained a disability or have a condition or have had a condition since their birth. And entering school as a person with a disability at a primary school age is vastly different from able-bodied children who enter into school. So do you want to talk about, the onboarding experience of a child with disability or a condition entering to school and how that differs, not just for them, but for their parents?
So I guess for kids with disabilities, the process of transition to school starts often a lot earlier, and there's definitely a lot more work that goes in the year before going to school. So it's a good idea for families to be starting this process early, I guess is the first thing I'd say. What tends to happen is that there's a meeting with the child might go on a tour of the school, or the family goes on a tour of the school, and then there'll be a meeting with the principal and learning support and often school counsellor or a classroom teacher. And they'll go through different options for different education, what the education might look like for the child, and then try and find the situation that would fit that child the best. So there tend to be three main options at least in government schools. There's a child goes into a mainstream class and they may or may not need support teacher hours. The second option is that they're in a mainstream school but in a support unit. Support units tend to be smaller classes of like 5 or 6 kids, with 2 teachers, and in that option there's the ability for a child to be either completely in that support class or otherwise partly in that support class and partly in classes in the mainstream classes as well. So like, for example, someone might do English and maths in the support unit and then they go for music and art, so they might be in their mainstream classes. So there's a bit more flexibility in that option. And then the third option is called an FSP, or a school for specific purposes. And they are schools that are completely for kids with higher level support needs. So what tends to happen is after that first meeting the parents and the families have, then the school takes that information that they've got from the parents as well as any reports from doctors and allied health people, and they go, the school takes that to a panel meeting, and from there the panel makes a decision about what options they could offer this family. But things like placements in the support units or the SSPs, you have to be offered a place for those.
When we're looking at children, I suppose if they've come from having a disability that they from birth versus a child who's perhaps had an acquired disability, there's a little bit of a difference, I guess, in some of their school transitions. So if we're looking at going to kindergarten. Obviously, if a child's been injured before they get to school, then the school transition exactly as what Amanda said. If you've got a child that started school and then needs to go back to school but may have some differing needs and things. And again, it depends on if the kids have got a physical disability and or cognitive or intellectual disability. That can change a little bit in terms of what their needs are and within that sort of environment, which environment suits their needs best, especially if, they have different either physical challenges. We hope that any children who have physical challenges could be integrated into any school. The challenge comes, I guess, more if you've got more of the intellectual or some behavioural things that will require some really intensive additional support where that's best placed and things. And I think it can be a really different experience and stuff. And if you think about children prior to getting to school, and especially children who've got higher level needs for whatever reason, a lot of them are very nurtured in that sort of time where they're spending a lot of time with their parents. They also get to see a lot of other people, such as therapists and lots of medical teams, and have had a lot of things done to them in that very early years. So transitioning to school is like meeting a new whole other team, which can be a really anxiety inducing, learning all these new people that are coming on board and things. And for parents, and that separation of knowing their child's got some of their additional needs and then setting them to school where they're no longer hands-on. So during therapy and those early years, they're present, and then we're handing their child over to into a school environment, and that can be a really stressful thing for parents and things. So a lot of lead up and support, and allow your child getting to know kind of their peers as well as the support staff and things as early as possible. And sometimes in orientations, they can do that. They can actually meet some of the people that you're going to be, going to school with that next year, or that you might meet teachers' aides that may be working with them that following year, and that can also help with that transition. Also, for children who require medical things to be done within that school day is really challenging. So we give the example of a person who's got a spinal cord injury who's going to school. We've got to be thinking about lots of different things in terms of changing of positioning, pressure relief, especially if they're in a wheelchair, for example. We've got to think of their continence, and continence is a really big thing across the board for all children. And there's a lot of children who have additional needs that continence is part of that additional need and needing additional support for that. But it's not something that we talk about in the playground with our friends. So it's something that we need to be handled very sensitively.
The child has medical commitments that they need to make, which requires them to leave school hours and regular school hours, or, go to specialist appointments a few times a year, or probably more than a few times a year for a lot more specialist appointments. And this can interrupt the process of what would be a normal school work day, or school week, school month, school year flow for a child with a disability. There could be a level of students, teachers, parents not really understanding why somebody needs to leave so often, why they need to go to therapy appointments, why they need to go to the bathroom at regimented times through the day, that sort of thing. And that different life, we've had the onboarding process with the school. It's been very supportive, taking the parents through it, but now they're about to enter school with other students, which might not be entirely in their favour. How can this make children with disability, not prone to bullying per se, but how can this affect the child's experience with schooling, and how do we prep them for the potential of, some bullying because they're not running by the normal streams of school?
Yeah, it's a really, it can be a really challenging time for children, especially if they do have They can either have medical needs that need to be done to them at school. So, for example, if we're talking spinal cord injury, maybe catheterization or bowel, programs and things like that. But there's also therapy program stuff that may need to be done in school, and that might be things, like standing, like kids getting up in standing frames. They might have therapists that may come into school to work with them and things. So their day can be a little bit disrupted in regards to that, or it can work in their favor. It depends on how that's that sort of therapy is integrated into their normal sort of school curriculum and things like that, which can be really useful. There is the issue that children can miss a lot of school because of the propensity to need either medical appointments and things like that, or that they can get sick because of their condition, say for example urinary tract infections, or if they get prone to constipation and things, and they require time to be actually managed, I guess, at home to get until they're better. That disruption for the kids then needing to attend these appointments and things, maybe, specialist appointments, and they spend significant periods away from school, can actually interrupt those normal processes of building trustworthy friendships and being able to participate fully in that kind of school program, which then can put them a bit behind the eight ball in terms of their learning, and so they're constantly feeling like things are a real struggle, and they can really take a hit, I guess, to their self-esteem and things. So that can then lead to other behaviours or things where it makes it difficult for them, I guess, to form those friendships. So now, if you think about the other side of the coin, if you've got a friend that has a lot of these different needs, and they're sometimes at school and they're sometimes not, all kids want to belong and they want to be able to spend time with their friends. But if that friend isn't there all the time, then that tends to lend itself to them sort of making friends with different people as well. You know what I mean? Like in that kind of friendship groups, and the person who has the additional needs are coming back and forward, to and from school, but they don't know perhaps when they're going to be there that next day or not, and they miss out on a lot. And that interruption of that friendship group stuff is really hard. That can lead itself to, feeling like they're different and that they're being excluded. Things, normal trajectory of friendships, things can be interrupted a little bit. I think from a school's perspective, that communication prior to getting kids to school, for the staff to be really aware of the child's additional needs and how they can be best supported, and very much working with their strengths, but also be able to then work with the child and the family about what they're comfortable in, being able to sort of share information with the different, groups that child. So say, for example, that child's coming into a class where if they're perhaps in a wheelchair and they're coming into the classroom, we're preparing the other children with some information prior to that, whatever the child and the family feel comfortable in sort of sharing their kind of story. Often we do like little storybooks, about kind of some of the, this is about me. It tends to focus on, these are, yes, my physical challenges. However, it's about me and my personality, and these are the things that I love. And so kind of promoting it, I guess, about, and this is how you can include me. A story I tell you actually about my nephew with my brother and sister-in-law's blessing. They're part of a very big group of friends that goes away on holidays for every year. And my nephew has autism and epilepsy and things, and so he has a variety of sort of behavioural needs. And one of the things that my sister-in-law did was, in that big group of adults as well as the children, was to actually give them like a letter saying, this is the information about our son that helps to explain why he is like he is and why he behaves like he behaves. And these are the ways that you can help to integrate him. So please read this out. Talk to your children about what to expect with my nephew, you know, how he's going to behave, and how that you can help include him in the activities that you're doing and things. Once they had done that and all the parents were on board, all the children then came on board, and they had the best holidays now because they know and they embrace him for what it is, you know, some of the challenges that he has, but they look for the strengths in him, and they are very accepting of him, and they know when he gets tired, this is kind of how he may behave, and being able to recognize that. And I think there's so much value in that for schools as well. If you've got a child coming into a classroom and having some, you know, information about them to say, this is the way that you can engage best with my child, you know, or the, you know, their friendship groups and things, and that giving that autonomy and giving a bit more information as to why that is why it is. And if you've got questions, to really remove that kind of veil of like, it's okay to ask. If you're not sure, you know, be curious, not judgmental. You know, it is very much about being allowed to ask the questions if you're not sure, and very much looking about beyond the physical and actually looking for the personality and who is that person behind all these other additional needs.
Yeah, and I guess it's those kind of two steps as well. It's the education about what a kid has trouble doing and what other kids need to do to get around them and keep them safe. But then there's also, what are all the things that they can do and that they can be involved in, and what are their strengths, and how do you do things? What can the kids be doing with you so that you can be completely involved in that as well? So I guess there's those two steps of, how do we keep you safe? But also then, how do you get really involved? And so I think that education piece needs to be both of those steps.
Do you find that there is segregation where, like, you know, you've got people who are interacting, people with disabilities interacting in, I guess, a mainstream class, and then you've got other people who it might be a specific education unit? Do you find that the education unit meets the mainstream school frequently enough, or do you find that they're, you know, still a bit separate?
Oh, look, there can be a bit of both, and it depends on, I think the inclusion of going to the mainstream classes for subjects makes that crossover much easier, because then kids that I'm working with might say, oh yeah, this is my friend from the support unit, and this is my friend from drama, and this is my friend from music, or whatever it might be. So I guess, particularly when you're in high school and you're moving around classrooms, that kind of situation isn't so unusual, that you have your friends from different subjects, and it fits quite nicely in there. In the primary school, there is a little bit of that issue that Jodie was talking about amount of time spent with people to develop a friendship trajectory. It helps, I think, reduce the segregation if kids are going sometimes into mainstream classes as well, but there is still that. These are also kids that are being taken out for medical appointments, and they're sometimes in the support class and they're sometimes in the mainstream class. So I guess in my experience, I've seen a lot of the time they tend to be closer friends with other kids in the support class because they might just spend more time with them.
Yeah, I think in the playground, I know that if they're not integrated into the actual classes with them, that often they will kind of get them integrated in the playground, you know, like in break times and things, and if you have really committed staff who are very good at facilitating that kind of integration, like sometimes they'll have some of the teachers who have an interest in, say, for example, sport, will get out there and be inclusive of everyone, whoever wants to play, you know, a particular game, whatever they're playing, and almost the adult will help facilitate, that sort of integration, I guess, because what they're at risk of is that they integrate them both, and then all the kids with the support unit just hang around together anyway, and they're just still segregated from the rest of the playground. So they almost need to have that facilitation of them. I certainly know for some of the kids, you know, in my children's primary school, that if kids were having sort of social, finding things quite socially quite difficult, they would run classes, you know, in break times, for example, like craft. They'll go and do arts and crafts, you know, and have it in small groups, and then you could integrate kids with a variety of needs. So those children who may be more sensitive to, you know, sounds, you know, for your children who may have things like autism and things like that, and they hate the playground because it's so loud and overwhelming from a sensory perspective, that they would go in and have these times where once upon a time the kids used to be sent to the library, you know, because that was a quiet space. But now they're thinking quite laterally and thinking, well, maybe we can get them into small groups, help facilitate some of those friendships. By doing bringing together, kids with common passions, like with art and, you know, those types of things. Or if it's sport is their thing, they need to keep active at lunchtime about having, and it may be that it's beyond, it might actually be specific staff that come in to do that, you know, and things, you know, the sports in schools kind of, you know, guys that come and actually help facilitate that. And that's part of their role, is actually helping to do that, because there's a lot of kids in the playground that get a bit lost. They don't know what to do, who to hang with, you know, and they sometimes need that extra sort of facilitation. But that's a way that we can kind of be inclusive. So segregation does happen in schools, absolutely. The new policies and coming out in terms of integration in schools, I'll be interested to see the kind of outcomes of that, about what sort of things change, about making lots of schools accessible, and, you know, doing a lot of that kind of cross-pollination of, you know, making sure kids are integrated across lots of different settings. So it'll be very interesting to see how that kind of transpires.
And I have seen some really lovely work of teachers and SLSOs and kind of support staff, where they try and find good matches for kids across different classes, different support needs, and get them together for a common interest. And as Jodie is saying, something like a craft group, if you match people well and give them, they're in the same setting again and again and have similar interests, then relationships develop. And it doesn't really matter where they're from. So I guess that's a way that segregation is trying to be diminished. And that I have seen that work beautifully at times.
Primary school is really the one of the first interactions you get with forming how you're about to form your long-term friendships, even, you know, beyond into high school and then whatever. And I guess the experiences affect how you're about to approach friendships, relationships. There is a lot of things that children with disabilities, and we've talked about this when it comes to, like, we've talked about, you know, catheterization, therapy, stuff like that has to be done in schools, and things that are done outside of schools. And a lot of it, the children, very rightly so, wouldn't want to tell in great detail to their friends or even their teachers, even if their teachers do know about what sort of specialist appointments they have. There's also an element of masking your disability, because you don't have to say everything that goes on in your life, because some of it is genuinely traumatizing, and it's some of the stuff that, like, even teachers and teachers wouldn't be able to understand what goes on for a child with a disability who has to go into, I don't know, spinal cord injuries. It has to go into urodynamics. If people don't understand what urodynamics is, for example, it's actually very invasive for some children, can start at a very young age and continue on for their whole life. So how do you reckon that, like, translates to them masking their disability and trying to normalize themselves as much as possible to be able to, I guess, retain friendships?
With the masking, that does, I guess, people are hardwired to notice differences. Noticing those differences doesn't mean that they're viewed negatively. A lot of the time that can be like a interest. But I do think that if kids have had these negative experiences when the difference is noticed, and then they are more likely to mask what's going on for them and what they want to fit in. I think as well for kids, particularly with what you're talking about, if they've had a lot of kind of invasive medical procedures early on, they probably have had to speak about these things very openly, whereas they're quite private things. So it can be this challenge too about what's a reasonable thing to keep private and what's something that I should be sharing with everyone, because up until this time, it's been openly talked about with all of these medical professionals and health people. So it's a bit of a reset for the kid as well about what are things that I need to say and what are things that I don't need to say. Having said that, I think it was one part, but there's also if kids are masking to fit in, and you particularly see this with some kind of different types of impairments. You were talking about things like urodynamics. You see it a lot with girls with autism as well, that it was thought for a long time that autism was just a lot more common in boys, but then it was realised actually girls are masking their challenges in social situations so much, and they're quite good at masking them, that they're often not picked up as being autistic until or on the spectrum until they're teenagers. In one way, that masking helps them fit in socially and be and feel a bit more like everyone else. But on the other hand, it can really mean that they're not getting the support they need. I guess if you're talking about something like urodynamics to stay healthy, and it could be that they're viewing themselves in a more negative way, not just that this is a difference, but seeing that as a bad thing. I guess it can lead to those physical issues. So things like kids who don't want to catheterize at school because they go to the toilet in a different way, that can lead to a lot of other issues like the UTIs and taking time off school and all that sort of thing as well. It's a balance of trying to find what is comfortable for the child in terms of what they keep private and what they don't, and how they can do that, and also how to deal with these differences so that they stay healthy and maintain their self-esteem.
Children who I think for anyone who's got additional needs and things, they often have had a lot of things done to them, and they've been handled a lot more, especially during their childhood. For a lot of children, and you're giving the example of urodynamics and things, a lot of these procedures and things like that can be really medically traumatizing. Like children really, if they're not done well in a very supportive way, then children can experience a lot of medical trauma and things. And it's not just in hospitals and things, but you think they can have different negative experiences related to therapy or schooling and there's so much thrown at these kids on a daily basis that by the time they get to school, it's just another thing to add on to the pile. And I wondered, and how that then can kind of affect friendships and their ability to be able to integrate into that environment, about what information, you're saying, Amanda, about to share with others. And they are talking about things so openly about these things, and especially because I do a lot of work with children and things in regards to their continence. So we, teaching children about catheterization, and we're having people, like whether it's they traditionally their families would be doing it, prior to them being able to do that type of skills themselves. So they're relying on others to actually provide that for them. And actually having someone actually do that in a school environment as part of a procedure, that's just something that needs to have happen. You want to have a really good, trustworthy team, I guess, to be working with children doing these types of, intimate procedures and things like that. It can be really challenging, I guess, for them in terms of, how they then feel and what their self-esteem is, and how they are, needing to go out at different times out of the classroom to have some of these procedures done, and how that looks to others and how they perceive them and how they perceive themselves it's a really big thing for them. And I think we should never underestimate that. And some of their behaviours then can be reflective of some of this potential for early, when I say trauma, I use that fairly loosely, but things that where they become, sometimes they can go the opposite, become people pleasers, and so they allow children to take advantage of them. A lot of those kind of, trauma-based responses and things can come out in how they then interact with others. Fight or flight, freeze or fawn, they say that as trauma responses, and so that can then affect how other children see them because they're trying to cope with kind of the current situation.
I mean, yeah, we did talk about urodynamics and how invasive that is, but even a child learning how to catheterize is quite a confronting experience as well. And then on top of that, let's just say you do have physical therapy, physiotherapy, and, you have specialists like touching you. It really confuses what is okay and what's not okay.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's this real issue. And I guess as kids are starting in early primary school, they're really learning a lot about this idea of consent and personal space and who's okay to touch me and to see me and who is okay to talk about personal things and what is a personal thing. So that's something that's developing for all kids in those early primary school years. And I think the kids who have the experience of lots of invasive medical procedures, that can be particularly challenging to learn those ideas about consent. And I think it's really important for the health professionals working with them to be continually aware of that and to be asking the child's permission before they do something, even if it's having a chat with the child, directly talking to the child and then asking them before they start something. And I think that this, it's not just health professionals, it's also really good for health professionals to be helping families understand this from a very young age, because when you have a child who has to go through these procedures when they're very young, there can be kind of the holding a child down or more forcing them so that the procedure can be done. And it is done with this is really needed to help them and to help them to learn to walk or something like that. But if we can use other techniques that allow to build into that idea of consent, that can be more helpful. So things like use of distraction, that always including the child in the conversation, asking the child's permission, it can set some good foundations so that by the time the child's going to school, that they have an idea about my body and I'm going to be asked permission and what's okay, and who are the people that it's okay to talk to this about, and who are the people that I show my body, and these are the people that are helping me. So a doctor would be okay if they're asking me, but the child next to me, that isn't something that I'd be talking to them about, or that they shouldn't be touching me. Something along those lines. I think so. I guess that was a long story to say. I think we start setting it up from a very young age, that including the child, giving them a sense of agency, and asking for their consent.
While you were chatting, it did just occur to me when you were talking about medical procedures and holding down children for medical procedures in one way or another. It can cause some PTSD for people who are getting older, may not even be able to handle certain procedures anymore in an adult age because of the experience they had as children. How can we, I guess, stop that? Because, I guess, yes, we get back to the urodynamics thing, but that is actually for life. There's no way to avoid that unless you continually avoid your appointments and as an adult, but it comes at a health cost to you. Primary school is the first time you set the bar for how you're about to approach relationships, but it also, one of the key foundations for how you're about to approach literally everything for the rest of your life. And one of them is medical procedures that have to keep going into adult age.
Any child who has a disability and has required, and especially in the case for spinal cord injury, for example, I think as part of what that should be offered to them very early from the point at which they're dealing with their spinal cord injury, whether it's from birth or an acquired injury, that psychological support should be inclusive of that, because that medical trauma potentially that may occur over that time where they're having to do procedures where they don't want to have them done, or it is quite traumatic. I think having the ability to process that and deal with that at the time and keep on top of that throughout their life span, I think is really important. And I think that you'll see for, a lot of children who've had a lot of this, perceived trauma early in life and have had things perhaps done to them, again, holding down to, so we can catheterize them and it's one thing that I will never do. That is one of the big things I was very passionate about. It's just like they have to allow us to be able to do this and give that consent. And I think that having that psychological support to be able for that child to have a safe space in which they can talk about a lot of those kind of issues as a tune-up almost all the way through their life, I think is a very important part of being able to understand and also, I guess, empower them to know that, they're bouncing an idea off another a health professional who can advise them about, okay, how are you feeling about this? How can it be done next time? And kind of almost scaffold for them about ways that they might come up with different ideas about how they would like to see things done next time. And that, psychologists or whatever can help facilitate that for next time.
And it's worth doing that at the hard yards when they're younger on that collaborative approach, because as they get older, there is this kind of trauma response that starts setting in, as well as they're getting bigger and stronger, and it's harder to manage for them and harder to manage for the health professionals as well. So I think it's really important that including the child, being collaborative with them, giving them a bit of a sense of ownership of themselves, of their body, and what's going to happens from early on. There is obviously with very young children that cognitively you might not be able to do a huge amount with them, but you can definitely do things with parents, and you can definitely always ask a child if it's okay. You can be using a lot of other techniques like, okay, so this has to happen. How can we make it more comfortable for you? And doing things like social stories so a kid knows exactly what's coming up, as well as them getting to choose things that might make it an easier process for them.
If you were to think of your ideal support structures for like the child, but not just the child, the parents, they're concerned about their children. Very early on in this interview, we mentioned that, to the point, this will be the first time parents are not 100% there for their children and they need to be reassured that their child is going to be okay. And I know that that's a situation that's relevant for all parents whose children are in school for the first time, but there's just a bit of extra because now your child is requiring extra assistance and you're not there to provide that assistance. What sort of support structures do you think are missing, and what do they do well, and what do you think is missing?
I think it very much comes down to the willingness of the school in terms of the amount of information and their communication systems as well. I know that I've got friends who are teachers, and if they knew that a particular child was coming in with a particular disability into their class that following year, I've had many of them that have approached me, in my previous role about getting some more information about this condition, about how we can best set up our classrooms, how we can, go about approaching this child to actually get the best out of them, about how we can meet their learning needs. Are they better if they have particular, for example, toileting needs and things but they got worried particularly about, using the toilet when all the other kids at break times and it's chaos and school toilets are traditionally not the most appealing places to hang out in, and about how we can make that situation for them better in terms of whether they can have opportunities to go to the toilet outside of those times, but being able to kind of work with whatever their particular needs are. Let me tell you, there is no school that doesn't have a child with a disability in it now, whether they're diagnosed or not. So every teacher in a classroom will be looking at all their children, that they're in charge of, their individual needs and about how we can kind of work with those. So I think communication, not only for, between the teacher and maybe the teacher's aide, but also the assistant principals and the deputy and the principal. I mean, very much it comes down for how accepting and willing to go that extra mile. Even accessibility, for example. So you're going to school in a wheelchair and you're the first person that's been to that school in a wheelchair. I will guarantee you that there will be places that you won't be able to get in that school, and that may stop you from accessing different parts of the curriculum potentially. And so there's some schools that'll go, great, you know what, we're actually going to move, instead of having that in the library, we're going to go make sure we're going to do that lesson in that classroom that's fully accessible, so you don't miss out on that curriculum. There can be some really wonderfully supportive, creative staff that will make it fit around the child's needs. And it can take years, as you probably, can understand, for some of those like modifications and things like that, so that schools are very accessible. That can include like building ramps or putting in lifts and things, which can take, significant amounts of time and things to be able to do that if you do have a physical disability. But it's so important. And as I said, it comes down to, communication and preparation and commitment to the cause, and having parents as part of that kind of team of how things get delivered. There's times where the child can't be at school for various reasons. We've got some kids that will actually, the school will set up an iPad on like a little trolley and actually include them so they can still attend school, but the child will have an iPad at home so they can actually stream into the classroom and things like that.
I completely agree, Jodie, and I guess seeing it as a team with the child and the family and the school and the health professionals all working together with that child at the centre, and they're all involved in the process and communicating, and then it really works best. I think as well, as children get older, there's a lot of work that goes in at the beginning, and which is fantastic, but just that awareness that often shifts over time as a child develops, and depending on how they go kind of within the school system as well, things change. And so needing to have that flexibility of, this has worked up until now, but now things are a little bit different, so we need to shift things and change them.
Do you think that children with disabilities, with cognitive, physical, doesn't matter, do you think that they should have counsellors to try and deal with like how they're going to approach the next stages of their life, I guess?
Oh, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really, because it's also a case of, it's great to have the support of this is how you cope with the situation, but you also don't want to create a situation for a child where they feel like there's something else wrong. It's that balancing act for the child and the time and what works for them. And it might even be providing that support to their support people, so to their parents or something like that, so that their parent can be handing on this information, but it doesn't feel like, oh, there's something else wrong. There's another therapist I have to see. And I guess as a psychologist working with kids, I tend to come in for sometimes and then I'll step away for a little while, and then maybe something will happen and I might pop back in. So it's more kind of each individual at different stages and what they need.
And it's also adjustment to their disability. You know what I mean? It's about kind of doing these little tune-ups, throughout their life at different times. Exactly what Amanda said about, I think that is really healthy, being able to discuss that, give them the tools, the toolbox, I guess, about how to do coping and things, and when you're feeling overwhelmed, and, the importance of breathing, and, all those kind of skills that we would use to assist, as well as the kind of counselling aspect about how to talk them through different situations or things that they come against. I think that idea of, that throughout their life there is definitely preparation for different life stages and how we're going to tackle that. And when people ask you about this, and as you move older and stuff, and you're looking at relationships and things like that, I think there's certainly some merit in almost preempting those conversations. And I think we'll talk about in the next podcast about that transitions onto adult services and what that looks like and how we prepare best for that. I think it's really important, that sort of psychological support and when you need it along the way, it's very much about an adjustment, and we kind of, reset it again and right, okay, what are our current kind of, challenges and how we kind of best can prepare for those and how we can deal with them at the time. And then, new challenges will come up and things. So, it's very much like a little tune-up along the way.
I was going to say, it's also that adding some more skills to the bag.
Yeah.
And it's kind of these kids are developing lots of different strategies to cope, and then something else comes up and maybe they add a couple more, and just a refresher in those old ones of, I could do that worked before. So I think if they have those skills as well and can be doing that themselves, it can really help self-esteem too. It's like, I can deal with this. And then just adding a little bit more as they need it, as transitions happen, as things come up for them.
In February 2022, the Department of Education released an inclusion policy. There are 3 parts to this policy. The first one is better inclusion for people with disabilities, another is for students with behavioural concerns, and the third is removing restrictive practices such as suspensions.
Because particularly for students with disabilities or behavioural concerns, they are overrepresented in the number of kids who get suspensions.
The first 2 parts of the policy started in Term 4 of last year. For those listening overseas, the Australian school starts at the end of January as Term 1 and divided into 4 across 12 months. The third section of the policy is due to begin this year.
So it's a little bit too early to see how this is having an impact. I guess the ideas of it were they wanted to increase students' agency in making their own decisions and setting goals and expressing their views about education, and including parents and carers more, and doing a more social and relationship building with peers, and looking at including kids with being able to access all parts of the curriculum, as well as really upskilling and training teachers. It was talking about increasing adjustments and modifications for students with disabilities so that they can engage with all aspects of the school life, having strategies in place to prevent bullying, and the schools to work more closely with the students and the families, especially around transition points. From what I understand, that there's kind of mandatory training for staff in how to support inclusion of students with disabilities. There's always controversy around these things, and I think it took quite a long time to get to this point. There has been this question about that there is still schools for specific purposes, and so there is still some segregation and what should be happening with that. At the moment, the SSPs are still ongoing within the Department of Education. But I guess there's a real push to try and be more inclusive in education.
We talked a little bit about the segregation before and things, and there's certainly, I think, merit in some of the specialised schools for children with significant disability, whereby their learning needs and things are a little bit different to your average population, or their physical support needs or the cognitive needs, where they're very much life skills or very therapy-based. A lot of the schooling and stuff, goals and things are a little bit different, I guess, to traditional schooling, and where those children are best placed to make sure that they're meeting all their kind of therapy needs and their social needs and medical needs for that matter and things. And whilst a big one for integration in schools, I think there still is a role for a lot of the SSP type schools. For some children with some of the either behavioural or other things, you need very specific staff to be caring for them and for them to be able to work with those children's strengths in those environments that are tailor-made for them, instead of thinking, no, we're going to try to put these support units with these children that have very different needs into mainstream schools, and in fact they're going to be segregated anyway because they won't be able to access different parts of the school. There's definitely roles for that, for support units that work within like mainstream schools. I think we can do that. There's opportunities there to actually be able to do that better.
So is there anything you want to end it on before we go to the next episode?
You know what my favourite show is, don't you? That would be Ted Lasso, and I think it has a lot of beautiful life lessons in that show, and most important is the concept of being curious and not judgmental, and I think more people need to adopt that as their way of approaching life, not just disability but life, and having an understanding of why people are like they are, and asking that question and be less judgmental about that.
I guess who can follow Ted Lasso? I think it is that being curious, and it is just looking at everyone as an individual and trying to be constantly creative and open and curious and creative, and thinking, how can we shift things to make them better? How could they work differently? And I think it's being flexible. So creative and flexibility, I think, are the keys, and every kid that comes through is different, and so everything has to be done a little bit differently for everyone, and just always working towards the best and thinking that we need to rethink things sometimes, and what worked up to this point might not be working, and it's okay to change things.
In the next episode of Have the Nerve, Jodie, Amanda and myself talk about the transition between primary and high school, relationships and self-esteem. This episode has been written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood, logo art by Cobie Ann Moore. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, rate, review. It'll help us get more people to this podcast. Thank you for listening.